America's emergency oil supply, the reserve built specifically to protect this country from exactly this kind of crisis, has just fallen to a level not seen since 1983. Not since the days of Ronald Reagan's first term, not since the Cold War, not since disco records were still selling in stores. 319.5 million barrels, that's it. That's what stands between the United States and an energy shock the likes of which most Americans alive today have never lived through. And the reason sitting behind that number has a name, and that name is Iran. And the choke point it has spent months threatening to strangle shut is called the Strait of Hormuz. This is the story of how a single narrow waterway, barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point, brought the most powerful economy on Earth to the edge of its own emergency reserves, and why the number 1983 should be sending a chill through every single American filling up their tank right now. It started, as these things always seem to, with a promise nobody believed Iran would actually keep. For months, Tehran had threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, the vital artery through which roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products flow every single day, a route responsible for moving somewhere close to 1/5 of the entire planet's oil supply. Analysts called it saber-rattling. Traders called it leverage. Iran called it a weapon. And when the war with the United States escalated into open conflict, Tehran finally pulled the trigger. Ships stopped moving. Insurers stopped underwriting voyages through those waters at any price traders considered rational. And almost overnight, one of the busiest oil corridors on the face of the Earth ground down to what amounted to a standstill. The moment that happened, the United States faced a decision it had not faced in decades. Global oil markets do not care where a barrel is produced. They care about global supply and global demand. And when 20% of the world's daily oil movement suddenly disappears from the map, prices do not stay calm anywhere, including at a gas station in Ohio that has never imported a single drop of Hormuz crude in its life. That is the part most people watching gas prices climb do not understand. The United States produces more oil than any nation on Earth. It is a net exporter of petroleum products. And none of that mattered because oil is priced on a global benchmark. And when the world panics, the world pays more. And Americans pay right alongside everyone else. So Washington did what it was designed to do in exactly this scenario. It opened the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the enormous underground network of salt caverns buried along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, built after the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s, specifically to give this country a buffer against precisely this kind of shock. In March, the United States authorized the release of 172 million barrels from that reserve, part of a coordinated 400 million barrel intervention by members of the International Energy Agency, the single largest emergency release in that organization's entire history. It was supposed to be enough to bridge the gap. It was supposed to hold the line until diplomacy caught up with the crisis. Instead, week after week, the drawdown kept happening. 10 straight weeks of declining American reserves. Commercial crude stockpiles falling by millions of barrels in a single 7-day stretch, while the Strategic Petroleum Reserve bled another 9 million barrels in that same window. This was not a controlled release anymore. This was a country burning through its own emergency fuel tank in real time with no clear end in sight. And the human cost of that slow bleed shows up in the most ordinary place imaginable. A gas station somewhere in America where a single parent pulls up to fill a tank for the school run and watches the number on the pump climb past $4.50 a gallon, money that used to stretch through the whole week now barely covering half of it. That family did not start a war in the Persian Gulf. They have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz outside of a headline scrolling past on their phone, but they are the ones absorbing the consequences of a standoff 12,000 miles away, 1 gallon at a time. And that quiet, invisible strain sitting in driveways and kitchen tables across the country is the real casualty behind every clean statistic coming out of Washington. Let's look at exactly how deep this crisis actually cut, because the numbers are almost impossible to overstate. By the week ending July 3rd, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve had fallen to 319.5 million barrels, the lowest level recorded since April of 1983, more than 4 decades ago. The reserve's total authorized capacity sits at 714 million barrels, meaning America's emergency cushion had been drawn down to less than half of what it is built to hold. And the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was not the only warning light flashing red. At Cushing, Oklahoma, home to the country's single largest commercial oil storage hub, and the physical delivery point for key American crude futures contracts, inventories collapsed to just 20 million barrels, a level analysts openly described as entering a state of operational stress. One energy researcher called it a concerning pressure point with no immediate relief on the horizon. When the delivery hub for American oil pricing itself starts running dangerously low, that is not a regional inconvenience. That is a structural crack running straight through the foundation of the entire domestic energy market. Brent crude, the global benchmark that ripples straight through to what Americans pay at the pump, jumped 5.2% in a single day, settling above $78 a barrel, its highest level in weeks. President Trump himself acknowledged to reporters that every time the United States strikes Iran, oil prices jump. They did, almost on cue, every single time. And then came the number that should have stopped every American in their tracks. Speaking at the G7 summit in France, the president admitted that the country was running dangerously close to the edge, stating plainly that American reserves would run out in about 4 weeks if the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened. 4 weeks, not 4 years, not 4 months. 4 weeks between the world's most powerful economy and what the president himself described in blunt terms as bedlam. This is where the fear becomes real, where you have to sit with the most dangerous question hanging over this entire crisis. What actually happens if that 4-week window runs out? Executives inside the oil industry were already sounding the alarm before the reserve numbers even hit their lowest point. One senior Exxon executive told a room full of investors that the market was approaching what he called unheard of inventory levels. A president of a major energy consulting firm warned that inventory draws were inexorable, already sitting at historic lows, and that upward pressure on prices was not going away anytime soon. Meanwhile, shippers themselves grew too nervous to even test the water. The United Kingdom's own Maritime Trade Operations Center issued warnings of hostile action against vessels near Yemen, where Iran-backed Houthi rebels operate with impunity. A separate Maritime Information Center advised ships to avoid the Strait of Hormuz and its surrounding waterways entirely without explicit permission, rating the threat level as severe, even as diplomats scrambled toward a deal. Picture the scale of what that actually means. The most critical oil choke point on the planet, effectively a no-go zone for global shipping, at the exact moment America's own emergency cushion was thinning to a 40-year low. And look at who else was watching this unfold, because America was not the only country forced to confront the fragility of its own energy security. Japan quietly pulled almost its entire merchant fleet out of the Gulf, a silent exodus that told the world everything it needed to know about how seriously Tokyo assessed the risk. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, China sat on a strategic reserve holding more than 1 billion barrels of oil, a stockpile dwarfing America's own depleted cushion by a factor of 3. Asia as a whole, the destination for roughly 82% of all crude moving through Hormuz, found itself racing to diversify supply lines it had spent decades comfortably relying on. The crisis did not just expose a temporary American vulnerability, it exposed a structural fault line running underneath the entire global energy order, one where a single regime in Tehran could, for a matter of months, dictate the flow of 1/5 of the world's oil supply and force the wealthiest nation on the planet to start counting down the weeks until its own emergency reserves ran dry. This is where the domino effect really takes hold, because a crisis this size never stays contained to a single sector. Higher crude prices do not just show up at the gas pump. They ripple straight into airline ticket prices as jet fuel costs climb. They hit trucking and freight costs, which in turn get passed directly into the price of groceries sitting on shelves in towns nowhere near an oil rig or a shipping lane. Insurers, watching tankers sit stranded in the Gulf with premiums spiking to levels shippers considered unsustainable, effectively priced entire routes out of existence. Gulf states themselves scramble to move as much oil as physically possible through alternative overland routes like the East-West Pipeline, a workaround capable of carrying only a fraction of what normally moves through Hormuz by sea. Every one of these dominoes, aviation, freight, groceries, insurance, alternate infrastructure, fell in the same direction, all traced back to one narrow strip of water that Iran had turned into a geopolitical chokehold on the global economy. But here's where the story finally turns, because for all the leverage Iran believed it was building by threatening this choke point, the very depletion of America's reserves became the single greatest pressure pushing toward a resolution that ultimately worked against Tehran's own interests. Analysts widely believe that dwindling strategic petroleum reserve was a major factor pushing the Trump administration to finally pursue a peace deal to end the war. Not because Washington was weak, but because Washington understood exactly how close to the edge the country's energy cushion had actually come. And so, over a single weekend, the administration announced it had reached an agreement with Iran, a memorandum of understanding laying the groundwork for a lasting peace with the president, posting directly that he was authorizing the toll-free opening of the Strait of Hormuz and the immediate removal of the American naval blockade that had been choking off Iranian ports in retaliatory response. Ships of the world, he said, start your engines. And they did, cautiously, one at a time. The Disha, a liquefied natural gas carrier bound for a regasification terminal in India, became the first vessel of its kind to make the crossing, since the announcement a single ship carrying an outsized symbolic weight, proof that the choke point everyone feared might strangle the global economy indefinitely could, in fact, be reopened. But caution remained the operative word. Shipping companies quietly acknowledged it could take weeks for full traffic through Hormuz to normalize, and inventories, even under the terms of the New Deal, would continue falling in the short term as the system worked to catch back up. This was not a switch flipped back to normal overnight. This was a slow, careful unwinding of a 100-plus day standoff that had brought the global energy system closer to the brink than it had been in over 40 years. Here is the wall of reality that Iran now has to face, whether its leadership wants to admit it publicly or not. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz was supposed to be Tehran's ultimate pressure card. The one move capable of forcing Washington into concessions Iran could never win on a conventional battlefield. And, for a handful of tense weeks, it worked exactly as designed, driving American reserves down to levels not seen since the Reagan administration, and forcing a sitting president to publicly admit the country was mere weeks from a genuine crisis. But leverage built entirely on economic pain is leverage that erodes the moment the pain becomes mutual, and Iran felt that erosion just as sharply as the countries it was squeezing. Its own oil exports, the lifeblood of an economy already gasping under sanctions, ground down alongside everyone else's, while the world's major powers, from Washington to Beijing to Tokyo, accelerated plans to diversify away from dependence on a choke point Tehran had just proven it was willing to weaponize. Every ally Iran might have hoped to sway with this pressure instead walked away with a permanent structural incentive to insulate itself from ever needing the Strait of Hormuz that badly again. China building a billion-barrel cushion. Japan pulling its fleet rather than risk it. None of that reverses once the crisis ends. Iran did not just fail to win a lasting advantage. It handed the entire world a permanent lesson in exactly how far it was willing to go. A lesson none of those countries will forget the next time tensions rise. Consider, too, what this crisis revealed about America's own vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that will not simply disappear the moment tankers start moving normally again. A reserve built specifically to weather exactly this kind of shock got drawn down to a 40-year low in a matter of months, not because the reserve failed, but because the crisis it was designed to absorb turned out to run longer and hit harder than anyone in Washington had planned for. Replenishing 300 million-plus barrels back to anything resembling a comfortable cushion does not happen in weeks. It happens over years and significant cost, competing against a global market still working through its own scars from this exact standoff. The next time a crisis threatens Hormuz, and few analysts believe this was the last time it will, the United States will be starting that fight from a shallower reserve than it has had at any point in more than 4 decades. That is not a problem that gets solved by a single memorandum of understanding signed in Geneva. That is a structural weakness the country will be managing for years to come. Go back to that single parent, still pulling up to the pump, still watching the number climb, before it finally, slowly, began drifting back down as ships resumed crossing through Hormuz. They never saw the salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana emptying out barrel by barrel. They never read the Energy Department data releases or the maritime threat advisories. But every single one of those numbers, the 319.5 million barrels, the 20 million barrels sitting under operational stress in Cushing, the 4-week warning from the president himself, showed up in their life as one simple, brutal fact. Filling up the car cost more than it should have for months because of a standoff playing out in a stretch of water most Americans could not find on a map. That is the real weight of this crisis. Not the barrel counts, not the diplomatic memoranda. The quiet, compounding strain it placed on ordinary people who never had a say in any of it, and the sobering reminder that the emergency cushion meant to protect them from exactly this kind of shock had, for a handful of tense months, come closer to running dry than it had in over 40 years. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and leave a comment so this analysis reaches more people who need to understand what just happened. We will continue tracking this crisis as it develops.